And we're recording. Hello from New York City, everybody. There's a saying zipping around the internet right now that I heard from screenwriter and writer Catherine Pouget. Living in the past can cause depression. Living in the future can cause anxiety. Our best life is lived fully in the present. So, welcome to this moment. It's a weekly webinar series every Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. It's part of the Revolutionary Love Conference 2020. And this moment is also an artistic uprising and rally that's going to be on Saturday, April 25, to help motivate change for good as we head to the November elections. I'm your host, Ali Palmer, and over there is my co-host, Samir Salmanovich, whose name I got right for the first time in a week of doing these things, who's here to help us zoom everything along smoothly as we welcome our fantastic guest today. We're still waiting for him to come on the line, but at the bottom, we want to tell you a couple things. And one is we want to make sure that you're okay. We hope that everybody's staying safe, staying sane, and staying connected, which is what we all need to do in these times. We want to point out that at the bottom of your screen down there, there's a little icon that says Q&A. This is not just me talking and the great Reverend talking. We want to make sure that you are also part of the conversation. So go ahead and write your questions on the Q&A. And when Reverend Barber comes on, he will be on there too. I'm hearing that some people can't hear me. Is that possible? Can you can you let us know if you're not hearing me? I see on the Q&A, can someone just say, hey, hearing you or not hearing you? Because Samir and I can hear each other. Oh, SJ, thank you so much. Everybody's saying that they hear us. Ben, maybe it's your little icon down there, possibly, or your volume. Okay, everybody can hear. That's wonderful. Well, welcome for those of you who are now hearing as well. We want to tell you about the fact that our phenomenal guest today, are you here with us yet, sir? Well, he's not here yet, but I'm going to tell you about him anyways, so that you will have that all taken care of before we even get there. As far as I'm concerned, when the dictionary says a great man, the picture that you're seeing on your screen should come up. There are people who dedicate their lives, not to just themselves, but also to lifting the people around them. From the earliest stage, that's what he has been doing. He is the president of Repairing the Breach. He's an author and an activist. He's the motivating force behind Moral Mondays that started at the North Carolina state capitol and then spread across the entire country. He is the tireless activist who's fighting for equality with liberty and justice, finally and truly for all, by continuing and co-leading the work of Dr. Martin Luther King with the Poor People's Campaign. He is, of course, Reverend William Barber, and we're hoping to hear from him any minute now.
We're here.
Hooray! Technology worked!
Hello.
How fabulous.
Yeah.
Hello, Reverend. Thank you so much for joining us today.
We're glad to be here. Glad to be here today on these difficult times.
These are difficult times, sir, it's true. Well, we have a lot of people here with a lot of questions, but before we get to them, there were a couple things that I was concerned about that I would love to hear your thoughts on. The first is my fear that this current crisis with the COVID sheltering in might divide the haves and the have far less thans even more than they have before. A third of the nation is suddenly jobless. People like me are gigless. People are incomeless. The billionaire owners of Amazon, at the meantime, are printing money like never before. How do we stop the corona crisis from dividing us even more?
Well, I think part of what we have to do in moments like this is always something that the Bible speaks of, and that is the truth will set you free. And right now, we're dealing with so many untruths, and not just coming from Trump, but certainly pushed by the administration. One of the first truths is we have to recognize is that this is something that we're working with the think tank, and they put it like this. Epidemics emerge along the fissures of our society, reflecting not only the biology of the infectious agent, but patterns of marginalization, exclusion, and discrimination, the coronavirus pandemic is no exception.
Mm.
And so what we have to realize is that a pandemic does exactly what a pandemic does, or an epidemic. It exposes all the things that we did not take care of prior to the epidemic.
That makes
And
perfect sense.
one of the ways we have to keep it from further dividing us is to own that this crisis is a crisis on top of a crisis. That the crisis did not start 60 days ago or 90 days ago.
Mm.
When we talk about even death, and I know that's sometimes a hard thing to hear, but let me put it in perspective for you. We are talking now that there have been 1,102 deaths from this pandemic, and that is hard, horrible, and traumatic, devastating. But your listeners need to know that prior to the pandemic, 700 people were dying a day from poverty and low wealth.
True that. It is absolutely true, sir. Even here in New York
Mm-hmm.
City, where they're calling it the epicenter right now in America of
Mm-hmm.
this horrible crisis, the largest number of people who are infected and are sick and are dying are in Elmhurst, Queens. 1/3 of all of our cases are in Elmhurst, Queens, and it is the low income and the immigrant communities that are being affected first and foremost.
The very communities that, for instance, if you look at this bill that just came up for stimulus, is not addressing. And America has a terrible history, whether it's the swine flu epidemic in 1919 and other things that have happened. We've had a terrible history of when we're in crisis, not doing two things. During the crisis, reaching down to the bottom and lifting those people up. Is almost as though if we tend to think if we can just handle the people at the top, the middle, and the top, then it'll go away. And then secondly, we've had a terrible history of not addressing the things we need to prior to an issue. And so right now, for instance, even the way we're approaching the virus is coming from a wealth advantage point when we say things like, well, everybody needs to stay 6 feet away from each other. Well, how do homeless people do that if we don't provide ways for them, to have shelter and whatnot? And should have done it before. We say stay home. But how do people stay home that didn't have a living wage prior to this, so they have no disposable income that allows them to stay home?
True that, sir. And I also wonder about people who are 10 to a house with only one bathroom. How are they supposed to deal with it as well?
So part of what we have to recognize in this moment, hopefully, the country will come to see that in a pandemic proves to you that until the billionaires understand they're connected to the people on the bottom. See, in a pandemic, what you realize like this, what you find is that the germ doesn't know class. The germ doesn't know anything about whether you're Prince Harry, Prince of England, or whether you're a senator, or whether you're on the street.
Mm.
If you touch the wrong surface or get the wrong droplets, the germ is gonna get you. It doesn't know. The germ proves that it can be powerful enough to shut down everything. See, it's not just shutting down the hospitals in the wealthy community; it's shutting down the hospitals everywhere.
True that.
And so that ought to be the unifying factor, so that we stop looking at the divides and start more looking at the vulnerabilities that should unite us all. And once we're united around the vulnerabilities, maybe then we will come together and have the unified fight against. Remember what that think tank said? The pandemic exposes the fissures of our society that allow the epidemic to spread.
And Reverend Barber, that actually leads to one of the first questions we got here from Elizabeth. She says, Reverend Barber, I love how your work with the Poor People's Campaign is continuing the work of the Reverend Martin Luther King in linking Black, white, and brown people who should be and would be powerful allies. With Fox News spewing lies to frighten people, how do you reach them and get them to hear a different side of the story?
Well, Fox News was designed to do what Fox News does, and Fox News is spreading a lot of lies. Even administration now, I was just watching where they are now openly blaming the Chinese rather than taking, that's a racist piece that goes all the way back to Chinese immigration. When we blamed the Chinese in the 1800s, and Frederick Douglass stood against that.
Right.
And they're blaming former administrations. So this blame game is there. I think one of the ways that we deal with the lies that are out there is we build among all people. So the Poor People's Campaign, long before this virus, we were in Appalachia, we were in the coal mines of Kentucky, and we are in the Delta of Mississippi, we're in California, and we're in the Carolinas, bringing together thousands upon thousands of people who are united around an agenda to address systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, the war economy, and this false moral narrative of religious nationalism.
Remember sir, excuse me. Can you say that last line one more time? The false,
go
ahead.
The false moral narrative of religious nationalism and white evangelicalism. I mean, if I can take an aside, notice how quiet white evangelicals are and religious nationalists are now. Now, we were talking about attacking gay people and attacking a woman's right to choose. They would be loud. They're not saying anything against this administration that's putting us all at risk.
Right.
But I want to correct one thing that Dr. King showed us and why we're doing it the way we're doing it. The Poor People's Campaign actually was not Dr. King. It was the women's welfare rights workers that pushed Dr. King. It was the Jewish Federation. It was Cesar Chavez. It was Native. Sometimes in our appropriation of history, we miss that.
True.
And Dr. King said in 65, and this is something that he said in 65 at the end of the Selma to Montgomery March, that every time black and white poor people have the power to come together, he called it the Bourbon class, the aristocracy, sows division. So one of the things we should take from what the Fox News is doing is that their actions are actually out of fear. They know that the demographics have shifted. They know the power that we have if we build relationships between poor and white and brown poor people. They know that the people who voted against Trump the most were people under $50,000 a year. The question is, do we know that? And are we willing not so much to worry about changing them, but building the kind of coalition and mobilizing it that can change the entire narrative of the country? And that's what we're tending to focus.
I think that's a great way to focus, sir. And one of the things that you're doing, I know, is on June 20th. Can you tell everybody about that, please?
On June 20th, 2020, we had planned a massive Poor People's Assembly Moral March on Washington. Now, since then, Washington, D.C. has shut down any large gatherings until further notice. But in the midst of this, when we see the poverty and the pain that existed prior to this pandemic, when we see the fact that we did not have health care and now we need health care, we did not have living wages, we now have living wages. A month ago, we were being told anything that talked about universal health care was quote-unquote socialism, that we didn't have the money for it. Now, all of a sudden, we can find $1 trillion, $2 trillion, $3 trillion. We have to mobilize. So we're not postponing June 20th. We're transforming it. And the transformation is we're going to build the largest online, virtual, digital, social media gathering of poor, low-wealth people, moral leaders, and advocates ever in the history of this country and possibly the world to say poor and low-wealth people are not going to be ignored. You cannot ignore 43% of the nation, 140 million people, and think somehow we can meet the challenges of everyday life and life in the midst of an epidemic. And so we're going to ask all of your people to tune in. We have just put out on MoveOn.org a moral response to poverty and pandemic. And the first night that we did a Facebook Live discussion about it, we had 250,000 people to show up on that.
I think
because
people are
people
ready.
are, they're ready. They're ready.
Yes, it's absolutely true. They are ready. And I would also like to put the call out to my communities, which is the artistic communities, artists
Hmm.
everywhere, musicians everywhere. This is something that unites us all. It's the same fight. Like Reverend Barber was saying, it's the same fight. No matter how much you have in the bank, this is all our fight together. So let's turn to
It's
some questions that some people who are joining us have.
okay.
Samir, got one for us? Uh-oh, Samir, can't hear you, pal. You're muted.
Hello, I'm here.
There you go.
Hi, hello, Reverend Barber. I am here
Hello.
in Harlem and helping out Zoom us through this. So, a question that we have here: what do we consider being part of the group of poor people, and how do you define that? If you can give us a sense
I'm
of
glad you
that.
asked that. Yeah.
Mhm.
We have a definition. Charlie Gupta Barnes is an economist and a lawyer that works with us, and we work with the Institute for Policy Study. And when we started the Poor People's Campaign, again, we found that one of the reasons we haven't been able to really deal with the issue is that everybody was using the government's numbers for poverty. They are woefully short. It does not truly measure poverty. So we look at two numbers. All the families in the country that are less than 400,000 away from emergent economic disaster, and all of the families in this country who get some kind of assistance without which they would be in dire poverty. And when you put those numbers together, the economists tell us that the number is not 39 million poor people. It is 140 million poor and low wealth people. 43% of this nation, 61% of all African Americans, 66 million white people, which is only about 26 to 30% of white people, but 66 million white people, actually more whites in poverty than blacks. In raw numbers, more blacks in poverty in terms of percentage, and over half of our children are in poverty and low wealth. And to put that number in perspective as well, that's 62 million people who make less than a living wage, 54% of African Americans, and this existed prior to the pandemic. And Columbia University did a study and said 250,000 people die every year from poverty. Another perspective, prior to this, 7 people died from vaping. We said it was a national emergency. 700 people die a day from poverty. We Republicans racialize poverty, Democrats run from poverty. We
Right.
did not deal with the reality of poverty. Now, in the midst of the epidemic, we are seeing the results of that negligence.
We are all connected. No matter what, we're all connected. And so therefore we can't be hiding things anymore. I think that's one of the reasons that we've all slowed down now into our homes, is to see the reality. So thank you for bringing that up. We have another question here, which I think is a very good one. The man who would be president was asked a simple question last week. The reporter asked, "What do you say to a nation that is scared?" His answer was shocking in its ineptitude. We have people across the nation watching right now. What do you say to them about their fear? Those things that wake them up at 4 o'clock in the morning with this unknown disease, this invisible foe. What do you say to people?
Well, I think it's real. I think the first thing I've learned in pastoral counseling is you don't take away people's feelings. It is real, and it is serious, and there's no need to tell people that it's not real. And in this moment, when you're facing fear, it's important, number one, that we turn and to each other. I know some people say that's a cliche, but it's not. It's a time, and we cannot, even though we are isolated in some ways, we have to find ways to continue to communicate with each other.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing, when you're in a fearful moment that's been caused, you take time to examine the roots of that fear and the cause of what is creating the fear. And then thirdly, since it has caused fear, then you do what you can. You begin to plan, even in the current moment, to change the realities that created the fear in the first place. And a lot of what we recognize is the coronavirus is one thing, that's nature. But the negligence of men, the negligence of administration, the negligence of people, the negligence of our politics is another thing. may not be able to totally control nature, but we must make a decision to turn our fear into focus and into fighting back to shift the things that we can change. And those are the actions of mankind and humankind and our politicians and the negligence that we have seen. This is a good moment in the midst of our fear, frustration, and anger to make a decision that we will emerge from this moment more committed. We will emerge from this moment more loving. We will emerge from this moment more focused. We will emerge from this moment and transform the society. Dr. King said something when the 4 girls were killed in a Birmingham church that was meant to create a sense of fear all across the South. He said that those 4 girls died. He said, but they speak to us from their deaths. And as they speak to us from their deaths, the question is, in essence, how, he said, sometimes life is as hard as steel, but there are moments that in those places we learn how to move forward. And I've asked everybody this question. As we are fearing our last breath and the possibility of our last breath, if we were to contract the Cyrus, what would you do? What kind of world would you fight for if you knew you were about to breathe your last breath? And that's the question. What kind of world would you fight for? What kind of justice? What kind of love would you fight for with your last breath? Well, it's time.
It is absolutely
time to fight for that world.
You're right, and that's exactly what this moment is. And we can't just be looking into the future and thinking, oh my gosh, what could? We have to be looking right now, what can?
That's right.
So, unfortunately, that's our time, everyone. And Samir has put over in the chat box the website where you can connect with Reverend Barber's ongoing amazing work. He has been very vocal, in case you didn't know this, in Washington, D.C., in making sure that there are protections for all people, not just corporations. He has done incredible work and continues to do so. So thank you for that, sir. You can join the Mass Poor People's Assembly and Moral March on Washington virtually on June 20th. There'll be more information coming up about that. This Moment rally, our rally on Saturday, April 25, is still going to be an artistic uprising, but it will now be online and right in your living room. So make sure you join us for that. On April 1st, we'll be sending out some details. We want to thank our amazing guest for taking time out of a truly mind-numbingly busy day and life to speak with us. And you can share today's This Moment with your friends by visiting thismomentaction.org. For Samir, Ben Perry, from Middle Church, and for Vote Common Good, and for me, Allie Palmer, thank you. Stay safe, stay smart, stay connected, and as my band Betty says, we're all in this together. So stay as connected as we can be. Thank you so much, Reverend Barber.
See you next week, everybody.